Hello, welcome back to our next WIMBA session, which has us beginning the respiratory system. This is the beginning of the end. We've got the respiratory system. Once we are done this, we're going to tackle urinary, kind of go through digestive, and if we have time, reproductive. So at the very least, I know we have at least two more systems once we're done with the respiratory system to go through. So you are well on your way to surviving A&P2. With the respiratory system, I know you were given some notes during lab. You had gone over the structures of the respiratory system in lab. Please know that that information, those structures, diagrams, and all that stuff is fair game for your lecture exam. Sorry about that. And so you need to be reviewing that as well as we go along this. But to save time, I'm going to be skipping that in during lecture and throughout the WIMBA. So again, please make sure you review your lab notes and lab information as it pertains to structures associated with the respiratory system. And so I need to ask you, just as a refresher, what do these three items have in common? And of course, as we discussed in class, if you were to take a layer of saran wrap and cover that tennis court, and then take all of that saran wrap and shove it into that 2-liter soda bottle, you would have the approximate amount of surface area contained within just one lung. Double that for both lungs. We are talking about, just as a point of reference, we are talking about 807.3 square feet of surface area contained within your lungs. That is a tremendous amount of area for which that your structures, specifically the alveoli, have in order to conduct respiratory functions in conjunction with the respiratory system. So don't ever lose sight of that. Don't ever lose sight of the immense complexity that we have within this system. It seems like it is a very simple system. It is a very straightforward system, but yet when you look at the minute structures and the amount of area at which that covers, I mean, within your thoracic cavity, you have the surface area of that which equals 2 regulation size tennis courts. Phenomenal amount of structure there. Again, don't lose sight of that. There are 4 basic functions found within the respiratory system that you need to also be mindful of. The obvious one is that of exchange of gas between the atmosphere and the blood. When we say the exchange of gas, we're primarily talking about oxygen and carbon dioxide, and how exactly the body goes ahead and gets oxygen from within the atmosphere into the blood, and how it removes carbon dioxide from the blood and puts it back into the lungs to be expired or expelled out of the body, back into the atmosphere. Regulation of pH. This is going to very clearly, regulation of pH is going to come down to one simple task, and that is the removal of CO2. As long as the body can remove or conserve, but typically remove carbon dioxide, it will be able to maintain proper pH within the body. Protection from irritants and pathogens. Again, we have, and I'm going to use the abbreviation for this, but we have the pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelial cells. Well, I did the abbreviation wrong. Pseudostratified ciliated columnar. There we go. So those pseudostratified ciliated columnar cells are what's going to be there to protect our insides, specifically the lungs, which is going to prevent anything from entering into the bloodstream. Those pseudostratified ciliated columnar cells. And then, of course, we have the aids in vocalization primarily through the larynx, which is where the Adam's apple or the voice box is, and the epiglottis, and all those other structures that are going to play a role in both control of air passage, vibration, and direction. All that combined into one aspect of creating the sounds that we have. We understand already, or at least we better understand already. If you are missing this or this doesn't make sense to you, please go back and review the cardiovascular system. But we should have that basic fundamental understanding that the right ventricle is going to deliver oxygen-deprived blood to the pulmonary system. It's going to do that through the pulmonary arteries, and that's going to then go into the lungs, where we will see the exchange with the alveoli through the capillaries, offloading carbon dioxide, loading on the oxygen, and then that newly oxygenated blood will return from the lungs via the pulmonary veins into the left atrium. That we already know. Going back to the immense complexity of this system, you need to visualize the fact that if you take a quarter of a 2-liter soda bottle, put blood in it, that is the amount of blood contained within the pulmonary system at any point in given time throughout your life. About a quarter of a 2-liter soda bottle. 75% of that is strictly found within the capillaries. Every single alveoli within those lungs has a network of capillaries surrounding it. And those capillaries are filled with blood. And that blood is moving throughout that pulmonary system at a very high rate, 5 liters per minute. 2.5 2-liter soda bottles are flowing into the lungs every minute. Imagine drinking 2.5 2-liter soda bottles of soda in 2 minutes. That's what you have flowing through that pulmonary system every minute. You have the same amount of flow that goes throughout the whole entire body in that same amount of time. So we have a very high flow rate that happens within the pulmonary system, but extremely low blood pressure. Extremely low blood pressure. Right? And that needs to be rationalized out. If you've got a high rate of flow going through this pulmonary system, how does that equal low blood pressure? It all goes back to this picture. And specifically, it all goes back to the connection with the tennis court. You have that extremely low blood pressure of 25/8. We get that because that alveoli, that lung tissue, is spread out over the area of a tennis court. That blood is going through the pulmonary arteries. It's entering into the bronchioles and then dispersing like cockroaches when you turn on the light. It's dispersing into all of those tiny, tiny networks of capillaries and blood vessels. And I've got to correct something. Getting caught up in my own excitement. That blood is going to flow from the pulmonary arteries into the blood vessels associated with the lungs, not the bronchioles, into the blood vessels associated with the lung, down into those capillaries. Because of this extreme network of blood vessels and capillaries found within the lungs, that blood loses any and all potential pressure in it and drops. And so when we talk about why the low blood pressure, low resistance. Low resistance comes from the fact that we have low ventricular pumping force. Huge. And I want to make sure you understand this. Huge surface area. Huge surface area. And then the fact that the blood is traveling such a small distance throughout large arteries. All of these things. All right, but it's specifically, and I will jump up and down until I turn blue and red in the face. This is where it comes from. That huge that blood has no other option other than to drop its pressure once it hits those capillaries. It's already low going in, but once it hits those capillaries, it's done. If you have had any kind of chemistry course, whether it's been in high school or at the college level, you will probably have been introduced to Dalton and Dalton's work on pressure. And basically what Dalton has said, and Dalton is going to be combined with Boyle, Charles Boyle, and we'll see him on the next slide. But Dalton did a lot of work with pressure, and what he basically said was that if you take the partial pressure, and when we talk about partial pressure, what we are referring to is the partial pressure is the pressure of the individual gases within a gas. Right? Partial pressure is the pressure of the individual gases within the gas. So, atmospheric pressure is 760 millimeters of mercury. That's how much pressure is being applied down onto you by the air surrounding you as you sit wherever it is that you are sitting. But we understand that atmosphere, that doesn't make any sense, that the atmosphere is made up of multiple kinds of gas. We know that we have nitrogen. We know that we have oxygen. We know that we have carbon dioxide. We have methane. We have ozone. We have water vapor. The list goes on and on and on. We know that. We understand that. If you take the pressure of each of those individual gases, which is simply the pressure of a single gas times the percentage, the pressure of the gas times the percentage of the gas in that specific atmosphere. In other words, what is the atmospheric pressure of nitrogen? Well, we know that nitrogen, at least I hope we know, that nitrogen makes up 78% of the atmosphere. 76, 78, it's within that ballpark. But 78% of the atmosphere. If we times that 78% times 760, so in other words, 760 times 0.78, what we end up with is 593 millimeters of mercury. So nitrogen, out of that 760 millimeters of mercury, basically consumes or adds or contributes 593 millimeters of mercury to the atmospheric pressure. Oxygen. We know that oxygen is 21% of the atmosphere. And so following that same suit, you would do 760 times 0.21, which would equal 160 millimeters of mercury for oxygen. Carbon dioxide, and I'll just kind of take you through that one as well, is 0.0035%, which means you take 0.0035 times 760, and it comes out to about 2.26 millimeters of mercury within the atmosphere. So that's the pressure that's being applied to us. We need to understand that, because when we talk about atmospheric pressure, what's going to start driving, as we're going to find out on the next slide, what's going to start driving the exchange of gas between the circulatory system and the respiratory system is this pressure. It's all dependent upon this pressure. So we need to understand this. Specifically, what we are concerned about, or what we are paying attention to, is the pressure contributed by oxygen and carbon dioxide, because that is what we're taking in and giving off respectfully. I mentioned Charles Boyle, and I just want to kind of bring this into light a little bit more. This is a guy that made, or at least is given credit for, developing the relationship between pressure and volume. And basically what he said was, he goes, as you change pressure, you're going to change volume. So you can take your initial pressure and volume within a container and say, well, what's going to happen to one or the other if I change the other? Right? So as an example, a 1 liter container is holding 100 millimeters of mercury. That's the pressure of the gas. The volume decreases to 0.5 liters. What happens to the pressure of the gas? Well, you decrease the volume. So in other words, you're taking that same amount of 100 millimeters of mercury of gas, whatever gas it is, that's now sitting in 1 liter, and you're compressing that gas into a half a liter. Your pressure is going to increase. And that's exactly what we see happening here. All right, so if we divide this into two different pictures, on the left over here, what we see happening is we have our 1 liter. In this case here, just to keep it simple, they're using one atmospheric pressure, if you would. And so everything's bouncing around just nicely. Pressure's all there. Everything's good. When we turn our attention to the right side, we see that we have reduced the volume. You see that we have reduced the volume by a half a liter. When you reduce that volume, you automatically increase the pressure. And you can see that pressure is up to 2 atmospheres. All right. Now, you may be sitting there and you may be saying, who cares? That's pretty straightforward. And as you change pressure, you change volume. As you increase the volume, you decrease the pressure. As you decrease the volume, you increase the pressure. Right? That's basic understanding. But if it wasn't for that basic understanding of pressure as it relates to space and volume, we wouldn't be able to really function with the respiratory system that we have. Right? Because as volume changes in the chest cavity during breathing, it causes a pressure gradient. Here we go. Back to these gradients. Right? It causes a pressure gradient. So one side of this system is going to have a higher pressure for a specific gas. The other side of this system is going to have a lower pressure within this gas. We understand, as with everything else, whenever we talk about a gradient, we understand that within this specific scenario, gas is going to move from an area of higher pressure to an area of lower pressure. The gas is going to move according to the pressure. It's going to move from an area of higher pressure to an area of lower pressure. So if you increase the volume within the chest, you're going to decrease the pressure within the chest. All right. Now, when we say within the chest, we're really talking about within the lungs. You're talking about that alveolar pressure. It's going to fall. When it falls, the pressure in the alveolar space falls, which means it's going to fall below the atmospheric pressure. Air is going to move, or that gas is going to move from an area of higher pressure to an area of lower pressure. So it's going to move from outside of the body. It's going to move into the nose, into the mouth, down the pharynx, into the larynx, down the trachea, down into the bronchi, into the bronchioles, down into the alveoli. It's going to move from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration. If you do just the opposite, if you decrease the volume of the chest, you relax the intercostals, you relax the scalenes, you compress your chest, you lift your diaphragm. That's what happens when you decrease the volume. Alveolar pressure is going to rise. When it rises, that pressure is now greater than the atmospheric pressure, so that air is going to go from the capillaries surrounding the alveoli, into the alveoli, up the bronchioles, into the bronchi, up into the trachea, through the larynx, pass through your vocal cords, into the pharynx, out the mouth. It's going to produce a sound. Out the nose, it's just going to leave. We consider this to be bulk flow. The movement of all of that air in and out of our system is what we refer to as bulk flow. I just got done mentioning the diaphragm. The diaphragm is that thin layer of muscle that is basically separating the thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity. But it's doing more than that. When that diaphragm when that diaphragm constricts and contracts and drops down, it's increasing the volume, which decreases the pressure within the alveolar space, which is now higher than the atmospheric pressure. The lungs expand. And in order for that air to move, it must be greater or less than the atmospheric pressure. And that's what we've been saying. This slide summarizes exactly what I got all hyped up about on the previous slide. When air moves into the lungs, we call it inspiration. When the air moves out of the lungs, we call it expiration. One inspiration followed by an expiration equals one respiratory cycle. One inspiration followed by an expiration equals one respiratory cycle. And this is basically where we are. All right. According to Boyle, how would we force the air into the bodies? We would force air into our bodies by changing that relationship between the pressure. If we look at this specifically, you've just got done taking a breath. Expiration is done. There's a pause before you start the next cycle. So for a split second, alveolar pressure equals alveolar pressure equals 760 millimeters of mercury. It just so happens that atmospheric pressure also equals 760 millimeters of mercury. When that happens, there's no airflow, there's no movement, everything stops. So in order to get that next breath, in order to have that inspiration happen, alveolar pressure needs to drop. Alveolar pressure needs to drop. Right here, this needs to lower. That needs to lower. It needs to, and think about it. We can't increase the atmospheric pressure. We can't look up in the air and say, increase. That we can't change. But what we can change is the volume of the thoracic cavity, which will then change the pressure. And it will, if we do it right, during an inspiration, that pressure drops. And it doesn't drop by a whole lot. It doesn't drop by a whole lot. It only needs to decrease itself. It only needs to decrease itself to about 758 millimeters of mercury. If it can get itself down that low, which isn't hard, it's now lower than the atmospheric pressure and air is going to move in. How do we do that? You contract the diaphragm. The ribs are going to move up and out by contracting the intercostals and the scalenes. That's going to increase the volume, which is going to decrease the pressure. And that atmosphere is going to rush into the nose, into the mouth, down the pharynx, into the larynx, down the trachea, into the bronchi, down the bronchioles, into the alveolar sacs. And then that oxygen is going to diffuse because we have another gradient here. And the only way you're going to get oxygen into the capillaries, as we will see in the next lecture, the only way to get that oxygen into the capillaries is if the pressure of the oxygen within the alveoli is greater than what it is in the capillaries. That will force diffusion. The only way to get carbon dioxide out of our capillaries and into the alveolar space to be expelled from the body is if the pressure of carbon dioxide within the capillaries is greater than the pressure of the carbon dioxide within the alveoli space. So this is all related as we get really deep into this. All right. And by the way, what kind of tissue do you think the lungs are made up of? The tissue itself has to be of some kind of epithelial. In order for all of this gas exchange to happen as freely as it happens, it's got to have some kind of thin cell tissue structure within it in order for it to diffuse the way that it needs to diffuse. And by the way, the diaphragm accounts for 60 to 75% of this total airflow that's happening. That's a large percentage of what's going on here. And so this diagram here shows exactly what it is that we have been talking about. Now, I want to throw in a little monkey wrench into this whole thing here. What happens if God forbid someone comes in and you get shanked. Here's my knife. Right there. And that knife punctures and enters into the lungs. Yes, I know. I'm going there. That knife enters and punctures into the lungs. What happens? You lose the ability to maintain pressure. You lose the ability to regulate and increase or decrease pressure by increasing or decreasing the volume because you lose all elasticity within the lungs. You've got a hole in it. It's kind of like you're up in the air in a hot air balloon, and an eagle comes by and lands on the hot air balloon and with its talons puts a hole into the hot air balloon. Hot air balloon deflates. Your lung deflates. It's what we call a collapsed lung. We see this very often happen with severe car accidents where either an airbag never deployed or someone wasn't wearing a seatbelt and they hit something in front of them and their chest cavity slams into the steering column or slams into the dashboard and they break a rib. And that rib, the broken end of the rib, punctures the lung. The lung deflates. You lose all that pressure gradient, everything just becomes equal. And until that hole in that heart heals up, you have a deflated lung. Now, luckily, you've got two lungs going on here, so the other lung will pick up. But it's hard for it to carry on for forever that way. And last thing I want to cover is, again, expiration. As volume decreases, air pressure in the lungs increases to about 761 millimeters of mercury. Remember, atmospheric pressure is equal to 760 millimeters of mercury. So we're only increasing it to 761, but that is just enough to get that alveolar pressure higher than the atmospheric pressure. Air is going to move from an area of higher pressure to an area of lower pressure, so that air moves from the alveoli up into the bronchioles, into the bronchi, up the trachea, into the larynx, into the pharynx, out into the nose or into the mouth, and it's expelled into the atmosphere. As I've already mentioned, when we do the in-between breath, there is a pause. There is no net airflow. There is no pressure difference. The pressure difference is zero. And that difference, so that means the internal pressure and the external pressure caused from within the air is equal. So you have no net movement of air in between a breath. Well, I'm going to catch a breath and bid you guys farewell for now. Continue studying. As always, email me with any questions that you have or jot them down and ask me during the next lecture. I'm always happy to explain in further detail anything that is confusing you. And we'll see the next time we meet, which will more than likely either be lecture or it will be lecture. So happy studying, and we'll see you later.